Welcome to Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines, your window into relationship, identity, safety, emotional awareness, regulation and intelligence, unleashed potential, passion and purpose.
Welcome back to Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines, and this is a Trauma-Informed Leadership Edition episode. I'm Krista Fee, and today we're talking about what happens when systems collapse. Let me be blunt. Ashes don't smell like roses. They smell like smoke, sweat, blood, and loss. And when leaders talk about restoring normal after collapse, what they often mean is sweeping the ashes into the corner, spraying some air freshener, and pretending that it never happened. But ashes demand more honesty than that. When families fracture, when organizations implode, when governments fall, the collapse leaves behind more than pain. It leaves behind systems in ashes, structures that failed, rules that broke, communication that corroded, trust that disintegrated. And let's get really honest, you can't heal by rebuilding replicas. If you try to slap a coat of paint over the same rotting beams, you're not building a future. You're reenacting the dysfunction that caused the collapse. Trauma-informed leadership calls us to something harder and holier. Helping systems be reborn. And rebirth never looks quite like the original. So let's talk about what it looks like when corporations burn. Think about Enron. For a while, it was America's darling, an innovative energy company hailed as the future. But behind the curtain, lies, manipulation, cooked books, and leaders so drunk on their own brilliance that integrity didn't stand a chance. When it all collapsed in 2001, employees lost their pensions, investors lost billions of dollars, and the name Enron became shorthand for corporate corruption. Enron didn't collapse because of one bad decision. It collapsed because the system itself was built on secrecy and illusion. When the ashes settled, the temptation in corporate America was to rebuild confidence with slogans like transparency and ethics training. But unless policies change, unless accountability, whistleblower protections, and transparent reporting structures were embedded, companies risked replicating the same sickness. And some did. Theranos, for example, 15 years later, another darling company, another genius founder, another collapse built on illusion and cover-up. The names change, but the ashes smell the same. What rises from ashes will always depend on whether leaders have the courage to build differently or whether they just want the stock price to look steady again. Let's talk about the psychology of replica building. Why do people rush to rebuild replicas? Because collapse feels unbearable. Ashes are uncomfortable. They force us to admit that something foundational was broken, not just a person, but an entire system. Psychologists call this reenactment. Trauma survivors, whether individuals or institutions, often recreate familiar patterns because even dysfunction feels safer than the unknown. Better the devil you know than the one you don't. Families, corporations, churches, governments, they all fall into this trap. And here's the danger. If you rebuild replicas, you guarantee relapse. Systems that collapse from betrayal will collapse again if secrecy and favoritism return. Families fractured by abuse will fracture again if boundaries are not enforced. Nations toppled by corruption will topple again if leaders keep protecting their own power instead of the people. Replica building is survival, but rebirth is transformation. So let's talk about building trauma-informed systems. 6 principles that change everything. How do you stop replicas from being built? We root systems in trauma-informed principles that resist reenactment. SAMHSA, S-A-M-H-S-A, gives us 6 solid pillars to work with. Physical but emotional safety. People need to know they can speak truth without being punished. Trustworthiness. Decisions made in the open. Promises followed through. No more smoke and mirrors. Peer support. Shared responsibility, not isolated heroics. Lone wolves make bad leaders. Collaboration. Real voices at the table, not tokenism, not performative inclusiveness, but actual shared power. Empowerment. Authority matching responsibility, no setting people up to fail. Cultural responsiveness. Systems that honor the actual lived diversity of the people they serve. So why does this 6 pillars make sense? Because the toxic behaviors that poison organizations look an awful lot like the addictive behaviors that poison individual lives. Denial, secrecy, manipulation, avoidance, power hoarding, and blame shifting. An addicted individual reenacts harm in their relationships until the disease is named and treated. The same is true for addicted systems. If we treat organizational collapse as the disease it is, then these trauma-informed principles become the medicine. Practices that detoxify communication, rebuild accountability, and create space for recovery. And just like in addiction recovery, it's not enough to white knuckle it. You can't willpower a system into health. You have to embed new habits, new rituals, new accountability structures. And when you do, systems don't just function, they heal. And healed systems produce new outcomes. Trauma-informed leadership says if we build with safety, trust, support, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural responsiveness, we're not just avoiding collapse, we're creating the conditions for rebirth. First responders and the cost of silence. Let me take you to a firehouse after a line of duty death. The department in shambles, grief everywhere. No one's talking about it. The culture of silence is strong. Suck it up. Keep moving. On the surface, the systems hold together. Calls are answered. Trucks still roll out. But inside, cracks are widening. Resentment grows. Alcohol use spikes. And morale plummets. They tried to rebuild a replica of business as usual. And the silence ate them alive. Eventually, leadership shifted. They began implementing trauma-informed practices, peer support programs, open debriefs after critical calls, access to counseling without stigma. Slowly, the system started to breathe again. The ashes didn't disappear, but they became the soil for something new. This is what rebirth looks like. Refusing to rebuild replicas of silence and choosing systems that heal instead. So here are the rise up rules of engagement. Communication used as a system saver. And here's the thing, systems don't just collapse because of policy. They collapse because of communication or lack thereof. That's why I created the rise up rules of engagement. They sound simple, but they save systems. First, no blame. Facts, not faults. No shame or guilt. Validate feelings without weaponizing them. No mind reading. Don't assume motives. Ask questions. No assumptions. Evidence before conclusions. No name calling. Dignity, even in conflict. Why does this matter? Because Gottman's research on relationships is clear. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, the 4 horsemen, predict collapse. Families implode when contempt enters. Marriages fail when defensiveness takes over. And guess what? Organizations do the same. The rise up rules are the antidote. They're how we build communication systems that prevent collapse and make rebirth sustainable. A family that refused replicas. I once worked with a family shattered by domestic violence. The instinct was to restore normal, but normal was exactly what nearly destroyed them. So instead of rebuilding replicas, they did something radical. They rewrote how communication happened in the home. No more yelling matches, no more assumptions, clear boundaries, therapy, honest dialogue. It wasn't easy. Ashes never are. But by refusing replicas, they didn't just survive, they transformed. The children didn't just learn resilience, they learned safety. And that family became a living picture of what reborn systems can look like. So let's bring your power into the present. The Phoenix discipline. Trauma drags systems backward. It chains people to old wounds. But rebirth requires present power. That means asking what is happening now, not what happened 10 years ago, not what we're afraid might happen again, now. Solution-focused psychology teaches us this, that when you orient to the present and ask generative questions, what do we want instead, and how do we get there? Systems stop rehearsing grievances and start rising. This is Phoenix discipline, refusing to live in ashes and choosing to rise up into now. So the weight of conviction. Rebuilding costs something. Here's the hardest part. Rebuilding systems definitely will always cost you. It might cost you in reputation. It might cost in relationships. It might cost your position. Leaders who choose rebirth instead of replicas rarely win popularity contests, but history proves rebirth is worth it. Civil rights leaders risked prison and death to rebirth a system rooted in injustice. Reformers in corporations lost careers to expose corruption. Families who chose boundaries lost the illusion of peace, but gained actual safety. The weight of conviction is real. The Phoenix doesn't rise without fire, and systems don't rebirth without paying the cost. So here's some practical anchors. Building systems that heal. If you're standing in the ashes right now, here's where you can begin. Name the collapse without sugarcoating it. Ashes are ashes. Call it what it is. Refuse to build replicas. Ask yourself, am I rebuilding for comfort and familiarity or for transformation? Integrate SAMHSA's 6 principles: safety, trust, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural responsiveness. Apply the Rise Up rules of engagement. Keep communication clean, accountable, and dignified. Stay in the present. Ashes are history. Rebirth happens now. So here are a few questions to ask yourself when you're ready for deep self-reflection. Where in my system am I rebuilding replicas instead of birthing transformation? Which trauma-informed principles do we most need to embed? What conviction am I willing to stand on, even if it costs me, so this system can rise up differently? Collapse is brutal. Ashes stink. Systems die. But ashes are not the end. Like the Phoenix, systems can rise, but only if leaders refuse replicas, only if they let ashes become fuel, and only if they have the courage to embed safety, transparency, and accountability in places that once thrived in silence and secrecy. Rebirth is never comfortable, but it is always worth it, because systems that rise up different aren't fragile. They become forged. So thank you for joining me today on Rise Up Voices from the Frontlines. This is a trauma-informed leadership episode. If this episode stirs something in you, share it forward, because the more leaders who refuse replicas and choose rebirth, the more our systems can heal, trust, and rise together. Join us in the Rise Up Trauma-Informed Leadership course and community, or have us come give a custom training or keynote at your organization, event, or conference. Feel free to book a free consult with me to talk about how you can rise up out of the ashes of your experiences and live and lead your life on fire.
Become a Rise Up Hero sponsor to provide mental wellness and crisis response resources for those who serve country and community. Join us in the Rise Up movement today.